Good day, Mom. I'm Ednalyn E. Santos from CA 200 Section B. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss about institutional-based correction. Introduction. This course is intended as an introduction to the correction system and will provide an overview of current institutional practices, policies, and legal issues. The course focuses on the relation of corrections to the criminal justice system, theories underlying correctional practice, and the role of institutions within the correction system. Specifically, this course provides an overview of the field of corrections. It reviews the historical development of crime and corrections, sentencing, jails, prison, correctional policies, agencies, prison life, and challenges facing correctional populations. It will further explore the principles and practices of treatment accorded to offenders in various types of correctional settings. Learning objectives. Assuming activity, study, and attendance by the end of the semester, students should be able to explain the historical development of corrections from the Middle Age onward and identify the purposes of the punishment. Describe trends in sentencing and corrections, including factors that led to mass incarceration and its racial implications. Understand the development and types of prisoners' legal rights. Compare and contrast the different functions and operations of jails, prisons, probation, parole, and intermediate sanction. Understand the issues regarding the incarceration of women. Demonstrate knowledge of the core controversies surrounding the death penalty. Explain the emergent problem of prisoner rentry and the barriers to reintegration. Identify the major challenges in contemporary corrections, including the risk in mentally disordered offenders, private prisons, soaring costs, and wrongful convictions. Discussion. Discussion of criminal justice issues may challenge personal beliefs and insight, emotional responses. Therefore, it is important to follow the norms of academic discussion and debate at all times. In 2018, the Philippines held the sixth highest prison population out of 21 Asian countries. As of 2019, the Philippines population rested at 108.31 million people, and 215,000 of those people were incarcerated. Therefore, the Philippines has an incarceration rate of about 200 per 100,000 citizens. There are 933 prisons running in the Philippines. Unfortunately, they are mismanaged and overcrowded. Below are 5 important facts about the incarceration system in the Philippines. 5 facts about the Philippines incarceration system. 1. Severe overcrowding. Rodrigo Duterte won the presidential election in 2016. He promised to end crime within 6 months. This promise also included the killing of tens of thousands of criminals. Duterte's elections led to the infamous war on drugs and eventually overcrowded prisons. Manila City Jail, the largest jail in the Philippines, is split into dorms that safely house 107 inmates. Currently, These dorms house around 500 people. Similarly, a room designated for 30 people holds about 130 in the Quezon City Jail. This severe overcrowding in prisons leads the illness and death tolls in the thousands. This picture shows the overcrowded prison. There are many people convicted because of law violations, like using drugs, murdering, rape, and other who commits crime. Number 2. Pre-trial detainees. According to the World Prison Brief, 75.1% of incarceration within the Philippines incarceration system are pre-trial. In 2018, 1,401,422 of 1,808, 278 prisoners were pre-trial detainees. Unfortunately, many people are serving sentences without conviction. Pre-trial detention is found in judicial systems all over the world. In countries like the Philippines, people may serve time that outweighs their crime. On average, prisoners in the Philippines are detained for 9 months without being sentenced. Pre-trial detainees is when someone is detained by the state while they are waiting for a trial to detainees with whether they are innocent or guilty of a crime. Number 3. High death tolls. About 5,200 inmates die annually at the New Bilibid Prison, NBP. According to the Ernesto Tumayo, the hospital medical chief, these deaths are due to overcrowding, dirty living conditions, and inmates' violence. At the 2019 Philippine Senate hearing, Tumayo said that there were uncontrollable outbreaks of pulmonary tuberculosis. In addition to overcrowding, poor living conditions, and inmates' violence, NBP lacks nutritional food and basic health care. On account of these living conditions, Tumayo reports that at least one prisoner dies at NBP each day. Thankfully, politicians and prisoner employees are working to reduce overcrowding in the Philippines prisons. Human rights advocates have also called for the release of vulnerable inmates, hoping to protect them from poor living conditions. High death tolls is the number of deaths resulting from the particular cause, especially an accident, battle, or natural disaster. Number 4. Vigilant justice. Duterte's war on drugs escalated during his presidency. Jobless citizens were recruited to kill anyone suspected of dealing, buying, or using drugs. This was one of few ways for some people to make money. Many homeless or impoverished people joined the vigilant teams. In 2016, Duterte told the public, "If you know of any addicts, go ahead and kill them yourself." Together, the Philippines police forces and unidentified gunner have killed 7,000 known drug dealers and users since Duterte's presidency in 2016. The Philippines' war on drugs has created the belief that extrajudicial violence and murder are necessary to fight crime. But the Human Rights Watch has turned the narrative around on Duterte. They are publicizing information about the vigilance justice in the Philippines. Vigilant justice often describes the action of single person or group of people who claim to enforce the law but lack the legal authority to do so. The last, number 5, corruption. In August 2018, the public learned a former mayor may have been released from the prison for good behavior. He was originally charged from rape and homicide in 1993. Similar story to corruption in the Philippines, prison continued to emerge. In September 2018, the public learned that a woman was told her husband's sentence would be shortened if she paid 50,000 pesos $970 later than a year. Senators state that inmates could live like kings for a fee. This information led to the further allegation prison workers and officials were taking bribes to bring and distribute contraband to inmates. The contraband in question includes cigarettes, cell phones, and televisions. Supposedly, inmates can also pay for personal cooks and nurses. Inmates who cannot afford a better life within the prison are stuck in the overcrowding and dirty rooms. Their inmates have higher rate and becoming ill and of death. Now that the corruption has been unearthed, officials are taking steps to weed it out one prison at a time. Corruption is a form of dishonesty or criminal offense which is undertaken by a person or the organization which is entrusted with the position and authority in order to acquire illicit beliefs and abuse power of one's person against. What is corrections? Correction describes the punishment of the offenders for a crime they have committed. Correction does not always mean punishment. In the United States, they expect their inmates to read the Bible to reflect on their wrongdoings. This picture shows correction is that proportion of criminal justice system charged with carrying out the sentence of the courts. Correction refers to the programs, services, agencies, and institutions responsible for supervising individuals charged with or convicted of crimes. The earliest record of the prisons come from the first millennia BC, located in the areas of mighty ancient civilization of Mesopotamia and Egypt. During those times, prisons were almost always situated in the underground dungeons where guilt of suspected criminals spent their life either awaiting death sentences and command to become slaves, offenders, workers, and galley slaves. Exception from the rule came from the home of modern democracy. Grace, their prisons were held in the purely isolated buildings where they could often be visited by their friends and family. Primary source of their detention were not dangerous, high walls or bars, but simple wooden blocks that were attached to their feet. Ancient Roman Empire, however, continued to use hardship methods. Their prisons were built almost exclusively underground, with tight and claustrophobic passageway and cells. Prisoners themselves were held either in a simple cell or chained to the walls for life or for time, as slavery was accepted norms in those days. Majority of the prisons that were not sentenced to death were sold as slaves or used by the Roman government as workforce. One of the most famous uses for the slaves in Roman Empire was as gladiators. In addition to fighting in the arena, sometimes after a lifetime of training in the special gladiator training houses, or luduses. Many slaves were tasked as a support workforce that enables smoother run of the popular gladiator business. The most famous gladiator battleground, the mighty Colosseum Arena in Rome, had a slaves' army of 24 slaves that worked daily as a power source of the complicated network of 24 elevators that transform gladiators and their wheeled animals opponent from the underground dangerous to the arena floor. The conditions in the European prisons remained harsh until English royalty started being more involved with their justice system. Henry II commissioned the construction of the first prison in 1166, together with the first draft of English legal system that used concept of jury. One of the most historic prison legislations was introduced in 1215 when King John signed Magna Carta, which stated that no man could be imprisoned without trial. With the rise of the industry between 16th and 18th century, English prisons became overcrowded, and new penal measures started being employed: military pardon and penal transportation. During the end of 18th century, over 50,000 prisoners were transported from the England to penal colonies in North America and Australia. France even continued their practice of penal colonies until the middle of 20th century. Most notable in France, Guyana and its famous prison, Devil's Island. And Russia also used remote penal colonies in the frozen northeast Siberia. The age of modern prisons that we know today started with the several prison reform in 19th century England. During that time, prisoners started receiving more care. Concept of rehabilitation was introduced and governments around the world, especially in UK and US, started reconsidering their views in solitary confinement, which was primary source in increases numbers of insane, suicidal, and catatonic prisoners. Wars that engulfed the world in the beginning of 20th century brought the formation of large amount of war prison camps and concentration camps. Most famous example of those type of prisons happened during World War II, when Nazi government formed over 300 detention centers in which political opponents, Jews, gypsies, criminals and others were detained without judicial processes. Majority of them was eventually killed on an unprecedented massive scale that is today estimated to be between 11 and 17 million people. During the end of 20th century, modern prison system was finalized. Concept of provision service was introduced in 1991, and 3 years before that first prison, intended solely for the holding of inmates in permanent isolation, was formed. Those supermax prisons became widespread across the entire United States, with over 40 of them being active in the year 2005. Inmates in those prisons are held in the 23 hours long periods of the isolation, with a cross-canal common yard time, work, educational program, and meals in cafeteria. As of 2006, it is estimated that over 9 million people are in prison worldwide with United States, leading in the rate of incarceration 743 per 100,000 people. Different types of prison. Antiquate times. This picture shows the history of prisons. From the birth of modern civilization in 3rd millennia BC, almost every major Asian civilization used concept of prison as a means to detain and remove personal freedom of the incarcerated people. In those early periods of history, prisons were often used as temporary stopgap before sentencing to death or life or slavery. But as time went on and our civilization developed, prisons started morphing into correctional facilities, started implementing the concept of rehabilitation, and reformed the prisoners. In addition of holding convicted or suspected criminals, prisons were often used for holding political prisoners, enemies of holding state, and prisoners of war. Religious rule in prison. Religious value in prison is often about its contribution to the individual growth or development of a particular inmate. The focus is to perceive rule or religion in helping lower of chance of recidivism among inmates. Other reasons, it focuses on the immediate value that religions have for inmates through their help in their coping and survival. The influence and practice of religions in the correctional settings is as old as the history of prisons. Initial entry of religions into prison was probably carried out by religious men who themselves were imprisoned. The Bible story of such a prisoners include Joseph and Jeremiah in the Old Testament, and John the Baptist, Peter, John, and Paul in the New Testament. Beginning in the days of Constantine, the early Christian church granted asylum to criminals who would otherwise have been mutilated or killed. Although this custom was restricted in most countries by the 50th century, releasing prisoners during Eastern time, and requests by church authorities to pardon or reduce sentence for offenders, remained for the centuries with the letter still in the sentence in a modified form. So religion within prisons. Under federal law, a prison or jail cannot substantially burden a prisoner's exercise for his or her religion unless it can demonstrate that it has a compelling interest that cannot be achieved through any other less or restrictive means. The law protects these rights for good reasons. The punishment of offenders. The following could be the punishment of the offenders. Incapacitation refers to the act of making an individual incapable of committing a crime historically by execution or banishment, and in more modern time by execution or likely periods or incarceration. So, incapacitation prevents future crime by removing the different from society. Example of incapacitation are incarceration, house arrest or execution pursuit to the death penalty. Deterrence is the idea or theory that threat or punishment will deter people from committing crime and reduce the probability and or level or offending in society. So, first, by increasing the certainty of punishment, potential offenders may be deterred by the risk of apprehension. For example, if there is an increase in the number of state trooper or patrolling highway on a holiday weekend, some drivers may reduce their speed in order to avoid receiving a ticket. Retribution, punishment inflicted on someone as a regime for a wrong or criminal act. Retribution may be a judge ordering or either a life sentence or the death penalty for someone after convicting. So, retribution is defined as someone done to get back or someone or the act of punishment someone for their action. An example of retribution is when someone gets the death penalty for committing murder. Rehabilitation, the action of restoring someone to health or normal life through training and therapy after imprisonment, addiction, or illness. Restoration, the action of returning something to a former owner, place, or condition. The most widely used component of restoration is restitution, because the most abused way to hold offenders responsible for the injuries they cause is for them to make restitution to the victims. Jails, a place of confinement for persons held in lawful custody, specifically such a place under the jurisdiction of location government, such a country, for the confinement of prisons awaiting trial of those convicted of minor crime. Compare prison. As you can see in this photo, many people are in prison for crime such as drug addiction, rape, and other crimes. Community corrections, probation and intermediate sanctions. Intermediate sanctions were developed for offenders whose crimes were not serious enough for incarceration, but who merited a punishment harsher than ordinary probation. The stated objectives of intermediate sanctions are the prevent cause-effects alternative to incarceration, deter offenders, protect the community, and rehabilitate offenders. Detractors claim that intermediate sanction also claim an appropriance of correctional reform, institute a mechanism for reclaiming limited resources of parole and probation, and provide administrators with a response to the more punitive orientation of the public. Probation, the release of an offender from detention subject to a period of good behavior under the supervision. The process of period of testing or observing the character of abilities of a person in certain rule. For example, a new employee. For an initial period of probation, your manager will closely monitor your progress. Provision is a direct judicial order that allows youth who is found to be delinquent or status offenders to remain in the community order, court-ordered supervision. Incrimination, to charge with or show evidence or proof of involvement in a crime or fault. Violation, an act against something, especially a law, agreement, principle, or something that should be treated with respect. Imprisonment, to confirm imprisonment especially as a punishment for a crime. The state of being imprisoned. Accomplish, a person who helped another commit a crime. One who international and voluntarily participated with another in a crime by encourage or assisting in the commission of the crime by a failing for prevent it through under a duty to do so. Confinement is the state of being forced to stay in a prison or another place which you cannot leave. Felony is a crime that is punishable by imprisonment of longer than 1 year. Common felonies include murder. Injunction. An injunction is a court order requiring a person to do cases doing a specific action. There are three types of injunctions: permanent injunctions, temporary restraining orders, and preliminary injunctions. Temporary restraining orders (TRO) and preliminary injunctions are equitable in nature. Bail. Bail is the security given for the release of a person in custody of the law, punished by him or a bondsman, to guarantee his appearance before any court as required under the conditions hereinafter specified. Commutation. Commutation, in the law, shortening of the term of punishment or lowering or the level of the punishment. For example, a 10-year jail citizen will be commuted to 5 years, or a citizen with death or may be commuted to life in prison. Detention. It is defined as the arrest and deprivation of liberty of a person outside of the confines of the nationally recognized law or international standards. Interrogation. Interrogation in criminal law, process of questioning by which police obtaining evidence. Disorderly conduct. Disorderly conduct in law. Intentional disordering by the public peace and order by language or another conduct. It is a general term including various offenses that are usually punished by minor penalties. Litigation. The process of taking a dispute to a court of law. If parties cannot agree between themselves about the fair and proper outcomes of dispute, they will be present their respective cases to a court for its judgment. Advisement. Advisement generally means the act of providing advice or counsel. In the context of criminal law, an advisement hearing may be held early on the allowed to court to advise the defendant of his right pursuant to the rules of criminal procedure. That's end of my report. Thank you for listening.